Over NBC's coast-to-coast network of independent affiliated stations, the University of Chicago Roundtable. Be sure to listen for a special announcement at the close of today's program explaining how you can participate in NBC's University of the Air by joining Roundtable home study courses. And now we present Joel Seidman, labor economist of the University of Chicago. Mr. Seidman.
It is hard to pick up a paper without seeing the names of Philip Murray, William Green, John L. Lewis, and Walter Reuther. To what extent can men like these call strikes and make decisions that affect the entire economy? Both the 80th and the 81st Congress have been concerned with labor relations legislation, the Taft-Hartley Act, the Lisinski Bill, the Wood Bill. Today we are going to discuss not the legislation that Congress is considering, but some of the factors behind the concern with that legislation. Who are these labor leaders, and how powerful are they? C. Wright Mills, author of The New Men of Power, a study of labor leadership, sociologist of Columbia University, and Lee C. Shaw, an attorney who represents business interests on labor matters, are here to discuss the question. Shaw, how powerful do you think labor leaders are?
Well, let me say first that labor leaders have too much power, and the manner in which they are using their power may wreck our economy. Sumner H. Slichter of Harvard University and many other economists believe that American society has been or is in the process of being transformed from a capitalistic to a laboristic society. And by a laboristic society, they mean that the employees are the most influential group in the community. Labor leaders are prone to take the position that labor leaders and only labor leaders speak for the American working man and woman. This position was taken by Bill Green, president of the American Federation of Labor, when he testified recently before the House Committee in the labor legislation hearings in Washington. I, of course, do not believe that the labor leaders are the only persons that understand the position of the working men and women in this country, or that they are their sole spokesman.
Mills, what do you think of the power of labor leaders as against other groups?
Well, I disagree with Shaw, Green, and Slichter. An impressive array, I must admit, but I disagree with them. I think that labor leaders obviously do have more power within the political economy than they once had. But I don't think they have as much power as top businessmen do today. And you must always consider those two things together. Furthermore, the increased power that labor leaders now have to get a larger slice from business to wage workers have involved a loss of independence, a loss of freewheeling action on their part, and has increased their dependence, not on the wage workers' power as such, but on the enlarged administrative state, so that such increased power as they have had is something of a Pyrrhic victory, as yet at least.
I think it's interesting to note that the labor movement has grown since 1933 from about 3 million members to about 15 million members. Whereas in 1920, only about 18% of the wage and salaried workers of this country were in unions, and during the Depression that fell to 10%, at the present time, about one-third of them are in unions, organized into some 190 international unions averaging 75,000 members each, so that unions are now of great importance in the life of our country. At the same time, we ought to bear in mind that two-thirds of the wage and salaried workers are still unorganized.
Mills, you are right that businessmen have power, but they understand that with power goes responsibility. I do not believe that labor leaders understand that with power goes responsibility.
Well, I'm not going to answer that directly now, but let's first look at a few facts about labor union leaders today. It seems to me that if you study them carefully, you find that they are union-made men, as well as self-made men of a new and rather curious type. Whatever the labor leader is, and whatever he does, responsibly or not, is, after all, dependent upon the character of his union. If you ask what labor leaders are like, I have to answer you that they are like their unions. And unions are many different things at different times. If a union is an army, and sometimes they are like armed camps, then the labor leader is a generalissimo or a sergeant, depending on his rank. If the union is a democratic town meeting, and some labor unions are that at given times, then the labor leader takes on the role of a parliamentary debater. If there, as frequently happens in democratic town meetings, a political machine arises, and many unions are that, well, then the labor leader is a political boss. If, on the other hand, unions are primarily business enterprises, then the labor leader is an entrepreneur. He organizes and sells wage workers to the highest bidders on the best terms available. If the union at the same time regulates industrial animosity, and they do that, as in holding down sit-down strikes, then the labor leader is a technician of animosity. He's all those things, and you have to consider all of them when you talk about labor leaders.
Mills, I understand you've made an exhaustive study about labor leaders. What does your study show about the origin of these labor leaders?
Well, first of all, you have to split, of course, the AFL from the CIO leader. That split runs very deep. It divides two types of men. On a simple matter like age, for instance, 3/4 of the CIO men, but only about a third of the AFL top men, are under 45 years of age. Again, in terms of when they took their first union job, the AFL man typically took it in 1918. I'm speaking of the international presidents now. The CIO only in 1935. Again, if you talk about education, which of course is related to age, well, about half the CIO, but only about a third of the AFL, graduated from high school or went beyond. Of course, only a fourth of the general population went beyond that grade of school, but nevertheless, if you wanted to summarize those simple facts, you'd say that the AFL top is older and less educated, whereas its bottom is younger and better educated. At the CIO, the top's a little older, but the big fact is that they are better educated than the bottom. So it's more of a sort of professional hierarchy in the CIO.
I think we ought to bear in mind the complicated pressures that operate on labor leaders. They are trying to organize workers who will respond for the most part only if they see the likelihood of benefits in the immediate future. Once workers are organized, their loyalty depends largely on tangible benefits in the form of higher wages, greater security, satisfactory adjustment of grievances. Moreover, the labor leader comes up for re-election soon, usually in a year or 2 years, and must build a following looking toward that election. He must keep his members employed and at good wage rates, and he must protect them against competition from outsiders. He must keep industry profitable enough in order to employ his members at good rates. He must get some control over management functions that affect the welfare of workers. And this brings us to the somewhat paradoxical position that where management is small and weak, unions serve as a stabilizing force. But where management is large and strong, then there is almost inevitably a clash over which are management functions.
I don't know what Mills' figures and statistics prove, and I certainly don't agree with you, Seidman, that labor leaders have stabilized even where industry is weak. I think that it's important to understand from our present strike situations that labor leaders have tremendous power and that power can be used and has been used in a way that is very detrimental and harmful to our economy. Furthermore, they create desires among their members to put the pressure on themselves in order to have the strike available to obtain their demands and therefore perpetuate themselves in office.
I wonder, Mills, if you could tell us something about a labor leader's career. What kind of career does he have?
Well, it is important to look at that because the way he acts depends to some extent upon what kind of career he's had within the union world as well as what position he occupies now today. As a matter of fact, as I said a minute ago, the labor leaders in general are self-made men. And I mean by that their origins are rather lowly. About 90% of them, contrary to what's the popular myth, are, of course, born in the United States. But on the other hand, they are definitely born in labor's own ranks. Their fathers are predominantly wage workers. There are some, of course, who come from small farmers and small businessmen, but at least 6 out of 10 of labor leaders today come from labor's own ranks. At the same time, there's evidence that a good many of them struggle pretty hard for such education as they have in night schools and other ways. Before the union, before they took union jobs at all, 80% of them were wage workers themselves. And in the union, they start at the bottom. 80% were local leaders or organizers of some type, and those who did start at the top of international unions probably founded that union and began it. Yet there's been a kind of shift in the career line that has developed in the last 10 or 15 years. The typical thing is still the wage worker struggling up into a position in the union. But at the same time, there's been a kind of white-collar link. A lot of white-collar people were unemployed, went into a factory during the 30s, briefly, and then went up the union route into a position of more power and, incidentally, more income. As a matter of fact, there are, of course, individual exceptions, but when Walter Reuther sits down with the president of General Motors, it's $10,000 sitting down against $450,000 per year. So they're way below their business opposites in income, but they're well above the wage workers whom they lead.
Mills, I'd point out to you that businessmen, too, have come up from hourly paid employees to the positions that they eventually hold. And I would also like to point out to you that John L. Lewis recently had his salary increased from $25,000 to to $50,000 per year. Petrillo, for example, gets $46,000 per year, and that all of these union officials have unlimited expense accounts.
Well, of course, that same thing holds for business officials. As a matter of fact, the average CIO and AFL president is well under $9,000 a year. Also, as I said, the expense accounts hold for both. I would be quite in favor of publishing both expense accounts in parallel columns anywhere you would want to suggest.
I don't think you'll find businessmen will be opposed to having such figures published, but I believe that some labor leaders will very definitely be opposed to it.
On the contrary, those figures are publicly available at the present time.
Not the expense accounts.
I think it's important to see how much power is in the hands of labor leaders as against the members that he leads. In some unions, I think, there has been a tendency to concentrate too much power. In the case of the United Mine Workers, for example, John L. Lewis appoints a majority of the General Executive Board, to which he is formally responsible. The Constitution of the American Federation of Musicians has a provision which empowers the President to change that Constitution at will, except for the provisions dealing with finances. I know of one case where a union leader has been elected president of his organization for life. Sometimes there are provisions in the Union Constitution rather loosely drawn that permit discipline. Provisions, for example, that allow discipline for adversely reflecting on an officer or insubordination or for other just and sufficient cause. Sometimes opponents have been suspended, charters of local unions revoked, and conventions skipped.
Seidman, do you think that unions will be democratic institutions and that their members will be protected from the union itself without a law requiring such democratic procedures?
I think that for the most part we have to rely upon the interest and the education of the rank-and-file members, but I think that in certain cases it is important for public policy to step in and protect the rank-and-file members. Those cases, I think, include the admission to unions, to see that workers are not barred unfairly from union membership and that they are admitted on equal terms with the others. It also applies to discipline, to make sure that workers are not improperly expelled from the organization.
I wish you would carry that message to the 81st Congress and also to labor leaders.
Well, I'm in favor of the Fair Employment Practices Act, for example. And I think that the labor relations legislation that we get in this country ought to protect these. At the same time, I would say that while it's important to see that a worker gets admitted to unions fairly, it is also important to see that he gets employment fairly and that he is not discriminated against, for example, because of race in either case.
Our subject, you'll remember, is how powerful are labor leaders. Let's go back and look at the effect of this power that labor leaders have on our national economy. It seems clear to me that a nation's standard of living depends on its productivity per man-hour. In other words, high productivity or high efficiency means a high standard of living. One of the most curious phenomena of contemporary labor union philosophy has been the rejection of the concept of increased productivity and efficiency as a means of increasing the real living standard of wage earners.
Well, it seems to me that you can't discuss this problem of the economic impact of the unions, Shaw, unless you also include in that political. As a matter of fact, the high productivity, which has bounded to undreamed-of heights in the last 10 years, occurred precisely when there were most workers organized and, moreover, was subsidized by a war economy and was not at the hands of business. However, the situation seems to have run something like this. First of all, unions tended to emerge as counter-forces to the enlargement of business enterprise. They equalized the bargaining power of unorganized workers against the more organized type of business concern. Then trade associations were formed by businesses to counter that union power, so that power both in the unions and in the businesses was centralized. And moreover, it was at the same time thrown into the political arena. That meant that the state enlarged its functions in all kinds of ways, as having to do with business and labor, and that the very fight itself of these two forces was institutionalized on boards and so on. Now, the labor leader in that situation is in a dilemma today. Politics and economics interpenetrate so much that we should refer always to the political economy, rather than to either politics or economics separately. But unions, as types of organizations, are primarily economic, certainly so from the standpoint of the wage workers. So that the labor leader, it seems to me, very often can be considered the last representative of the economic man. And they are trying to act in later phases of the political economy as if they were still in the earlier phases. As a result, many of them are becoming, particularly during wartime, go-betweens. Between, on the one hand, the state and monopoly corporations, and on the other hand, the rank and file. They're doing that at an economic price to business concerns, but nevertheless, that is the big role they began to play as fixers in the economy and the political economy at large.
It seems to me that union leaders do not object to improved productivity. What they want to be sure is that their members get the benefit of that, at least in fair measure, and that their members are not working themselves out of jobs by cooperating in increased productivity. I might remind you also that in a great many cases, businessmen have held up productivity when it was in the interest of their profit position to do so.
You take the position, Seidman, and I believe Mills said something about labor leaders being in favor of productivity and that perhaps businessmen have interfered with high productivity. I point out to you that one of the outstanding spokesmen for unions, namely Walter P. Reuther, president of the United Automobile Workers CIO, has taken the position flatly that his name should not be linked with any statement that wage increases depend on advances in output per man hour. Certainly, the achievement of high productivity has been over the strenuous resistance of many labor leaders, and that, I point out to you, is tremendously important.
Well, the reason Reuther takes that position, and I would certainly agree with him, is that he's trying to look at the wage-profit ratio, not at the production and wage alone, but to get into that picture, the profit ratio with wages. That's what the fight's really about in this whole thing.
Well, but you've got to also consider the position of many unions, that their wage demands bear no relation to productivity, and also that through their make-work devices, feather bedding, seniority without consideration of the ability factor, attempted control of supervision, etc., organized labor has pursued blindly the course of self-interest and dealt by that end severe blows to both the economic welfare of wage earners and the consuming public as a whole.
Beyond all question, the last several years have witnessed the rise of the most powerful labor movement we have ever seen. I think it might be interesting, therefore, to see what the effect upon profits has been. In 1929, by far the most profitable year American business had ever had until the war period, profits before taxes came to a little under $10 billion. In 1946, they had reached almost $22 billion. In 1947, just short of $30 billion. In 1948, they reached the astounding total of $34 billion. And if you take profits after taxes, again, they have risen from under $8.5 billion in 1929 to just under $21 billion in 1948.
Well, so far as this business of the pursuit of their interests is concerned, that comes rather strange from a representative of business interest. I thought that was the prime consideration of businessmen is self-interest. I certainly would judge so from their conduct. Now, what's happened, it seems to me, is that we have a situation in the political economy where there are competing interest groups. And the leaders and spokesmen of those interest groups at the hub of national power are trying to, each of them, is trying to enlarge his own interest group's take from the total production of the economy. What that means is that these spokesmen increasingly become, in all kinds of cooperative schemes among themselves to stabilize their own position, go-betweens of the formal apparatus of power and the rank and file of their own organizations. In this respect, labor leaders are like trade association heads, like the heads of the farm cartel that run the whole agricultural setup in this country, and many other such pressure groups. I am for more autonomy of power on the part of labor leaders as they are joined with wage workers as an independent force in the political economy.
Well, Mills, whether or not you know it, many businessmen, large and small business concerns, are vitally interested in the public's welfare as well as in the operation of their business. Now, so far as the figures which Seidman read off and the talk about profits, that has been very misleading to a lot of people. When you talk about profits, then you must go on and talk about the distribution of profits, the distribution of the shares of the products which are produced in this country. And since 1929, Seidman, the wage earner has more than doubled his real dollar as compared with the stockholders who have lost from 1929 through 1948.
I might also remind you, however, Shaw, that undistributed profits, which also belong to the stockholder, have gone up enormously. Whereas dividends by all corporations in this country rose from just under $6 billion in 1929 to $7 6/10 billion in 1948, undistributed profits, which belong to the shareholders, rose from $2.5 billion in 1929 to over $13 billion in 1948. This vastly exceeds anything that the wage earner has received.
Seidman, bear in mind that undistributed profits are necessary today to keep the producing materials and tools available because the demands of wage unions have discouraged capital investments. And if we're not careful, we're going to end up with socialism in this country, and perhaps that's what many labor leaders actually want.
When we talk about undistributed profits, I think it's also to compare that with the earnings that workers receive. In 1948, the workers received on an average in manufacturing industry only $53 a week. In that connection, I think it's interesting to note that just several years ago, the Department of Labor worked out a city workers' family budget to give them a modest but adequate living standard. That calls at the present time for approximately $62 to $71 weekly in the various big cities in this country, so that the family of four with only one wage earner in manufacturing does not receive this modest but adequate living standard.
That's a typically scholastic approach to a problem. You can prove almost anything with these statistics on what people need for a standard of living. The fact remains that the wage earner has enjoyed a much greater increase in what he receives from the return of the capital system than has the investor.
Well, it seems to me that we could argue a long time about the statistical technicalities of the way in which the economy operates. It seems to me also that the power of business rests upon money. And I, of course, agree with Shaw completely on the beneficent role that businessmen have of late been playing in the economy. Nevertheless, businessmen only represent, as an interest group, 7 or 8% of the population as far as the profit take is concerned.
Do I detect some sarcasm?
Well, there might be a little bit in that. The power of labor, on the other hand, rests on their organizations. And what I should like to see the labor leaders do is to work out a genuinely independent program, separated from business cooperation, if you please, both in the economy and in the political sphere. I want them to displace managers in the shop at every point that their power permits them. I want them to keep a continuous bookkeeping of the entire economy and given industries in it. And I want them to set up plans, whether they're rejected or not, for those given industries. And on the basis of that shop and economic program, both of them independent, I want them to launch a new party, which would be an autonomous force in the political sphere.
Mills, I notice in your recent book, New Men of Power, that you make the statement that unions are collaborating in making and administering company rules. And you're apparently worried about the fact that union leaders have joined with businessmen, and you think that's to the detriment of the worker. Is that right?
Yes, you and I are in agreement on that, Shaw.
Well, don't worry about businessmen letting unions get into the collaboration of making and administering company rules. They're going to very vigorously resist that, so perhaps your fears are groundless.
I'm for that, and if the big businessmen of America act as I expect they will act, they will radicalize labor to that extent.
There's room for improvement. There's no question about that.
On both sides.
I think we ought to examine, too, the amount of power that labor leaders have in the political sphere. It seems to me the record of the 80th Congress shows that labor leaders still have relatively little power, with the replacement of the Wagner Act with the Taft-Hartley Act, and the actions or the failure to act of Congress with respect to such important issues as taxation, prices, and housing. The record of the 81st Congress, similarly, has done little to help, with the Wood Bill almost approved by a few votes and then sent back to a committee, which means we don't have the Wood Bill, but unless further action is taken, we still have the Taft-Hartley Act.
Seidman, I hope you're right, that labor leaders do not have too much power in the political arena, but I'm afraid that you're wrong. And I'm afraid that during the past 20 years in this country, certainly since 1932, labor leaders have had a great deal to do with the government. Perhaps not always openly, but they have been very influential in the policies which have been followed by the present administration.
I would agree. I would agree with Mills that what we ought to have in this country is a labor political party so that labor can have its proper degree of influence in the federal government, something, it seems to me, it has not had. Unless we get that, or until we get that, then it seems to me a more intelligent political alignment in this country would be extremely important, so that you did not have Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans acting with regard to labor issues as though they represented the same party.
The politicians and the labor leaders both better be careful that they don't wreck our economy, which has been proven and established as the best economy which the world has ever seen.
Well, this statement keeps coming up, and I don't know what one means by the best economy. On the whole thing. It can mean many things by that. Certainly the highest productivity, as I pointed out a minute ago, has been achieved precisely under mass organizations of labor leaders and under a federal government subsidy. You certainly can't lay that at the door of business. However, what's happening here in terms of Seidman's statement is that the kind of involvement in the old political parties, which labor is deeply set in with, means that their power is not independent and will not be effective. And I don't look for any labor law that will amount to anything as far as real independent power for labor is concerned coming out of the current squawkers.
Seidman, I don't want to interrupt you, or rather, Mills, I don't want to interrupt you, but let's look at the record. Since the last war, our economy and the very strength of the country itself has been jeopardized by the power which labor leaders have exhibited in the forms of strikes, and often strikes for their own selfish interests rather than to protect the working man. We enjoy in this country today the highest standard of living that the world has ever seen. With approximately 7% of the world's population, we produce almost 40% of the world's goods. This has been accomplished by American businessmen under private ownership. The question before the public today, indeed the question before the world, is whether union leaders will permit businessmen to continue to accomplish this remarkable job.
Well, one thing seems sure, that the labor leader as we know him will not last any longer than the businessman as we know him. And whether either will last as we know him is the $64 question. Whether the labor leader, on the other hand, operates as an independent force depends upon and in turn grievously influences whether we will have slump or whether we will have war. But that, of course, is another question.
It seems to me that the sharp rise of profits in the post-war years and the failure of workers' living standards to rise show that labor organizations need more power as against businessmen in this country. They also need more political power.
I consider that dangerous thinking.
But at the same time that unions acquire more power, we must see that they remain democratic organizations with power vested in the members rather than concentrated in the hands of the leadership.
Thank you, gentlemen. You've been listening to the University of Chicago Roundtable discuss how powerful is union leadership with Lee C. Shaw, member of law firm of Seafarth, Shaw and Fairweather, Chicago. C. Wright Mills, Department of Sociology, Columbia University, and visiting member of the faculty of the College of the University of Chicago. And Joel Seidman, labor economist of the University of Chicago, as participants. This week's roundtable pamphlet includes the full text of today's discussion, reading lists, special materials on labor leadership in America. You will want to receive this pamphlet and to study the supplementary materials. Be sure to write for your copy and send 10 cents in coin with your order to the University of Chicago Roundtable, Chicago 37, Illinois. For $3, you may subscribe to the pamphlet for a full year and receive 52 weekly issues. I'll repeat the address, the University of Chicago Roundtable, Chicago 37, Illinois. And now, a special announcement.
19 years ago, the University of Chicago pioneered in American radio when it began the University of Chicago Roundtable, the first free, unscripted discussion by experts in American radio. Today, the Roundtable again pioneers a new adventure, combining radio listening and specialized study in its presentation of the Roundtable home study courses on world politics and economics in the modern world. These two courses offer you, the Roundtable listener, a unique opportunity to combine radio listening with study of a veritable library of competent reading material that will be sent to you if you decide to participate in this program of adult study, which you complete in your own home. These two courses are open to all, and you may begin at any time. Be sure to write the Roundtable or your local station today for the leaflet telling you all about these courses and how you may join.
This is NBC, the national broadcasting company.